April 1970, Berlin, Germany. Construction workers digging near the Lehrter Bahnhof railway station struck something that made the foreman halt the excavation immediately. Buried beneath layers of rubble, concrete and earth were human remains. Not unusual for Berlin, where unexploded ordnance and wartime casualties still emerged regularly from construction sites 25 years after the war's end. But these remains were different. The skull showed signs of bronze dental work, extensive and expensive. The location was significant, less than 500 meters from the Reich Chancellery bunker where Hitler had died. West German authorities called in forensic experts and historians. Over the following weeks, careful excavation revealed not one but two complete skeletons. Initial analysis suggested they were male, middle-aged, and had died around 1945. The dental work matched records from SS physicians. By 1972, forensic odontology would confirm what investigators suspected. These were the remains of Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, and Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, Hitler's personal physician. Both had been missing since May 1945, when they allegedly escaped the Reich Chancellery during the Battle of Berlin. For 27 years, rumors had placed Bormann in South America, living under protection of sympathetic regimes. The discovery proved those rumors false. Bormann had died within hours of leaving the bunker, likely from cyanide poisoning. His body had been buried hastily and forgotten. But the question haunting investigators was what else might be discovered if other burial sites were systematically investigated. What secrets remained buried with other high-ranking Nazi officials? What evidence of crimes, what documentation, what personal effects might still exist in unmarked graves across Germany and Europe? The story of what emerged when Nazi burial sites were opened after decades reveals uncomfortable truths about how societies handle the remains of those who committed atrocities. It demonstrates the tension between historical investigation and the desire to forget. It shows how forensic science can answer questions that written records obscure, and it exposes the reality that many Nazi leaders' final resting places remain unknown or deliberately concealed, their locations secrets that died with those who buried them. The examination of these sites over the past 50 years has produced revelations about the final days of the Third Reich, confirmed or disproved historical accounts, and forced Germany and other nations to confront questions about how to memorialize or refuse to memorialize perpetrators of genocide. To understand the significance of Nazi burial site discoveries, one must first comprehend the chaos of Nazi Germany's final days and the deliberate efforts to conceal the fates of high-ranking officials. As Allied forces closed in on Berlin in April and May 1945, Nazi leadership fragmented. Some fled to attempt escape, others committed suicide. A few remained in the Reich Chancellery bunker with Hitler until the end. The circumstances of their deaths were often witnessed by only a few people, and those witnesses had every reason to obscure the truth. The Allies wanted to capture Nazi leaders for trial. The Soviets wanted to claim credit for killing or capturing them. Surviving Nazis wanted to avoid responsibility. This combination of motivations ensured that accurate information about who died, where, when, and how was systematically suppressed, distorted, or simply lost. The most famous case, Hitler's death and burial, illustrates these complexities. According to testimony from bunker survivors, Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945. His body and that of Eva Braun were carried to the Reich Chancellery garden, doused with gasoline and burned. Soviet forces reached the bunker on May 2nd and allegedly recovered the charred remains. For decades, the Soviets claimed they had positively identified Hitler's body through dental records provided by his dentist's assistant, but the Soviets also spread rumors that Hitler had escaped, possibly to encourage continued searches that would tie down Western intelligence resources. The remains, according to Soviet archives opened after 1991, were buried and reburied multiple times, moved from Berlin to Magdeburg, where they were held in a Soviet military facility until 1970. In April 1970, as the facility was being turned over to East German authorities, the KGB made a final decision about Hitler's remains. They exhumed them, crushed the bones, burned them, and scattered the ashes in the Elbe River. No grave exists. No physical evidence remains except a skull fragment held in Russian archives, though its authenticity is disputed. This destruction of Hitler's remains was deliberate policy. The Soviets and later the Russian government did not want Nazi sympathizers to have a pilgrimage site. They did not want physical remains that could become relics for neo-Nazi movements. The decision to destroy the remains and scatter the ashes ensured Hitler would have no grave, no marker, no place where his memory could be honored. This set a precedent that influenced how other Nazi remains were handled. The Goebbels family presents an even more disturbing case. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, committed suicide on May 1, 1945, shortly after poisoning his 6 children with cyanide in the Reich Chancellery bunker. His wife Magda also died, either by suicide or killed by Goebbels himself. The children, ranging in age from 4 to 12, were murdered to spare them from living in a world without National Socialism. Soviet forces recovered all 8 bodies from the bunker and garden area. The remains were initially buried in a Berlin suburb, then exhumed in 1946 and moved to a Soviet facility. Like Hitler's remains, the Goebbels family's bodies were moved multiple times over the following decades. In 1970, they too were exhumed, cremated, and the ashes scattered. No graves mark their resting place. The decision to destroy the remains of the children along with their parents remains controversial, as the children were victims of their parents' fanaticism rather than perpetrators of crimes. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS and architect of the Holocaust, provides another example of deliberate obscurity. Himmler was captured by British forces on May 23, 1945, while attempting to escape using false papers. During interrogation, he bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth and died within minutes. British forces photographed his body extensively to document his death. He was buried in an unmarked grave in a forest near Lüneburg. The exact location was kept secret deliberately. British authorities wanted no shrine for SS members or neo-Nazis to venerate. To this day, the precise location of Himmler's grave remains classified in British military archives. Periodic rumors claim the grave has been found or that the remains were exhumed and destroyed, but no official confirmation has ever been released. Hermann Göring, Hitler's designated successor and commander of the Luftwaffe, committed suicide by cyanide on October 15, 1946, hours before his scheduled execution at Nuremberg. His body was cremated and the ashes scattered, denying him burial with military honors. The location where his ashes were scattered has never been officially disclosed. Like other top Nazi leaders, Göring's final resting place remains deliberately unknown. The pattern is clear. For the highest-ranking Nazi leaders, Allied and Soviet authorities ensured no grave sites existed that could become pilgrimage destinations. The remains were destroyed, scattered, or buried in unmarked locations kept secret. This policy was partly practical, preventing neo-Nazi veneration, and partly symbolic, denying these men any memorial or marker of their existence. But this policy left historical questions unanswered and created spaces for conspiracy theories to flourish. The lack of confirmed burial sites for many Nazi leaders fueled decades of rumors about escapes to South America, Antarctica, or other remote locations. The discovery of Martin Bormann's remains in 1972 demonstrated both the value and complications of resolving these questions. Bormann had been Hitler's private secretary, controlling access to the Führer and wielding enormous power in the Nazi state. He was present in the bunker until the end and allegedly attempted to escape on May 1 to 2, 1945. Witnesses claimed they saw him during the breakout attempt but lost track of him in the chaos. Some testified they saw him die, others claimed he escaped successfully. For 27 years, intelligence agencies searched for Bormann. He was tried in absentia at Nuremberg and sentenced to death. Rumors placed him in Argentina, Paraguay, Chile, and other South American countries with communities of Nazi émigrés. The 1972 discovery that Bormann had died in Berlin within hours or days of leaving the bunker resolved these questions definitively. Forensic analysis of the remains, including dental comparisons and later DNA testing, confirmed identity beyond reasonable doubt. The cause of death was determined to be cyanide poisoning, likely self-administered when escape became impossible. But the discovery raised new questions. Why had the burial site gone undiscovered for nearly 3 decades despite being in central Berlin? Who had buried the bodies and why had they not reported the burials? The location suggested that someone had buried Bormann and Stumpfegger deliberately, creating a grave of some permanence rather than simply leaving bodies where they fell. This implied that even in Berlin's final chaotic days, someone took time to bury these bodies properly. Who and why remained mysteries. The Bormann discovery prompted renewed searches for other missing Nazi officials. SS Obergruppenführer Heinrich Müller, chief of the Gestapo, vanished in Berlin in May 1945 and has never been found. His last confirmed sighting was in the Reich Chancellery bunker on April 28. Unlike Bormann, no reliable witnesses ever reported seeing Müller's body or death. This has led to theories that he escaped Berlin and possibly defected to Soviet intelligence, though no conclusive evidence supports this. If Müller was buried in Berlin, his grave remains undiscovered. Periodic claims that remains found in various locations are Müller's have all been disproven or remain unconfirmed. Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust's logistical implementation, was captured by Israeli agents in Argentina in 1960, tried in Jerusalem, executed in 1962, and cremated. His ashes were scattered at sea outside Israeli territorial waters to prevent any gravesite. This followed the established pattern of denying Nazi criminals any physical memorial. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy who flew to Scotland in 1941 in a bizarre attempt to negotiate peace, spent the rest of his life imprisoned. He died in Spandau prison in 1987, officially by suicide, though conspiracy theories persist about murder. His body was buried in his family plot in Wunsiedel, Bavaria. For years, the grave became a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis who held annual commemorations. In 2011, his remains were exhumed, cremated, and the ashes scattered at sea. The gravestone was destroyed and the burial plot eliminated. Even 46 years after his death, authorities decided that Hess's grave presented too much risk of neo-Nazi veneration to be permitted to continue. The treatment of lower-ranking Nazi officials remains varied widely. Those who died in Allied custody or were executed after trial were generally buried in unmarked graves or cremated without memorial. Those who died natural deaths decades after the war, having escaped prosecution or served prison terms, were often buried normally in German cemeteries. Some of these graves became problems when neo-Nazis discovered them and began using them as meeting points. German authorities have grappled with this issue repeatedly, sometimes exhuming and relocating remains to undisclosed locations. The Jewish cemetery in Berlin's Weißensee district presents a particularly tragic discovery. In the 1990s, restoration work in a section damaged during the war revealed that Nazi officials had used the cemetery as a dumping ground for bodies during the Reich's final days. The remains of executed prisoners, bombing victims, and others deemed unworthy of proper burial were thrown into mass graves in the Jewish cemetery, a final desecration. The discovery led to proper burial with memorial markers honoring the unknown victims. Forensic investigations of Nazi graves and burial sites have contributed significantly to historical knowledge. The examination of Bormann's skeleton revealed he had been in poor health in the war's final years, suffering from chronic illness that would have made escape to South America unlikely, even if he had wanted to attempt it. Analysis of remains from mass graves associated with concentration camps and extermination camps has provided evidence for war crimes trials and historical documentation of the Holocaust scale. Forensic anthropology applied to these sites has confirmed victim counts, identified individuals, and provided evidence that refutes Holocaust denial. The excavation of execution sites has revealed details about Nazi crimes that written records concealed or destroyed. Mass graves in Eastern Europe, discovered through archaeological investigation and sometimes revealed by locals decades after the fact, have shown the systematic nature of Nazi killings. The condition of remains, the evidence of how victims died, the artifacts buried with them, all contribute to understanding events that the perpetrators tried to hide. Some burial sites have yielded personal items, photographs, letters, and documents that victims carried with them to their deaths. These discoveries have identified individuals, reconnected families with information about lost relatives, and provided tangible evidence of lives ended. The ethical questions surrounding Nazi burial site excavations are complex and contentious. Some argue that all such sites should be excavated, the remains identified through DNA testing, and proper burial given to victims while perpetrators' remains are destroyed. Others argue that disturbing graves, even those of criminals, violates human dignity and creates problems without solving them. German law has evolved to balance these concerns. Graves of war criminals have no special protection, and authorities can order exhumation if the grave becomes a problem. But routine disturbance of graves simply for historical investigation faces higher legal barriers. The discovery of Nazi graves has sometimes resulted from accident, sometimes from deliberate search. Construction projects across Germany and Eastern Europe periodically uncover remains that require investigation to determine identity and historical significance. Former concentration campsites and execution locations have been systematically excavated as part of historical preservation and documentation efforts. Private investigators and amateur historians have occasionally located burial sites through archival research and local testimony, leading to official excavations. The case of the Stauffenberg brothers, executed for their role in the July 20, 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler, illustrates different treatment for Nazis who resisted. Klaus von Stauffenberg and his brother Berthold were shot in the Bendler Block courtyard in Berlin. Their bodies were initially buried in a Berlin cemetery, but were later exhumed by the Gestapo, cremated, and the ashes scattered. After the war, the Bendler Block became a memorial to the German resistance, and the Stauffenbergs were honored as heroes who tried to stop Hitler. This demonstrates how German society distinguished between perpetrators of Nazi crimes and those Germans who resisted. The resistors received memorial, honor, and remembrance. The perpetrators received obliteration and intentional forgetting. The search for burial sites of Nazi medical personnel who conducted experiments on prisoners has been particularly focused. Dr. Joseph Mengele, the Auschwitz physician who performed horrific experiments, escaped to South America and lived under various identities until his death by drowning in Brazil in 1979. His remains were exhumed in 1985 for forensic identification. After confirmation, the remains were held by Brazilian authorities. Debate continues about what should be done with them. Some argue they should be given to Holocaust memorial institutions as evidence of Nazi crimes. Others argue they should be destroyed to prevent any possibility of neo-Nazi veneration. As of recent reports, the remains remain in Brazilian custody, their ultimate disposition undecided. The burial sites of concentration camp commandants have been subjects of particular attention. Rudolf Höss, commandant of Auschwitz, was executed in Poland in 1947 and buried on the campgrounds. His grave site became part of the memorial landscape, a stark reminder that justice was served. Other camp personnel who escaped immediate justice and died later have no marked graves. their families often preferring anonymity to avoid association with their relatives' crimes. The documentation discovered in graves or in association with burial sites has sometimes provided valuable historical evidence. Personal diaries buried with their owners, photographs hidden in coffins, letters preserved in sealed containers, all have emerged during excavations. These documents have filled gaps in historical knowledge, corroborated or contradicted testimony, and provided insights into the final days of the Reich from perspectives not captured in official records. The treatment of Nazi burial sites by neo-Nazi groups has forced authorities to take measures that would be unnecessary in other contexts. When neo-Nazis learn of a grave site associated with Nazi leadership, they attempt to use it for commemorative gatherings. This has led to a pattern of discovery, brief publicity, and then rapid action by authorities to eliminate the site. The result is that many graves that might have been left undisturbed in other circumstances have been exhumed, cremated, and scattered to prevent their use for political purposes. The technology available for analyzing remains discovered decades after burial has advanced enormously since the 1970s. DNA analysis, not available when Bormann's remains were identified, now allows definitive identification from small samples. Isotope analysis can reveal where individuals spent different periods of their lives based on trace elements absorbed from water and food. Forensic anthropology can reconstruct appearance, determine health conditions, establish cause of death, and estimate time of death with increasing precision. These techniques applied to remains discovered from Nazi-era graves have resolved questions that testimony alone could not answer definitively. The international legal framework for handling Nazi remains has evolved through practice rather than formal agreement. Generally, remains of individuals convicted of war crimes or crimes against humanity receive no special protection. Their graves can be disturbed, their remains can be destroyed, and no requirement exists to notify family members or permit traditional burial rites. This represents an exception to normal rules regarding human remains, justified by the extraordinary nature of the crimes committed and the ongoing threat of neo-Nazi movements using burial sites for political purposes. The psychological impact on families of Nazi officials has received less attention but presents real human complications. Descendants of Nazi leaders often grew up not knowing their relatives' histories or knowing only partial information. The discovery or exhumation of an ancestor's grave forces confrontation with family history that many would prefer to avoid. Some descendants have embraced historical truth and even become advocates for Holocaust education. Others have resisted defending their relatives or denying the extent of their crimes. German society has generally shown sympathy for descendants while maintaining clear condemnation of their ancestors' actions. The commercial aspects of Nazi burial sites and remains have created disturbing markets. Artifacts stolen from graves, soil from alleged Hitler burial sites, and similar macabre items appear regularly on auction sites and attract collectors. German and international authorities have attempted to suppress this trade, with limited success. The existence of a market for Nazi-related items creates incentive for grave robbery and fraud, complicating legitimate historical investigation. The religious dimensions of burial and remains have also created tensions. Jewish religious law has specific requirements for treating human remains with respect. The discovery that Nazi officials had defiled Jewish cemeteries by using them as dumping grounds for their own dead created additional layers of offense requiring ritual cleansing and rededication of the affected cemetery sections. Christian traditions regarding burial have conflicted with the desire to deny Nazi officials religious rites or memorial. The Catholic Church, Protestant churches, and other Christian denominations have grappled with requests from families to perform funeral services for executed war criminals or to inter them in church grounds. Most have refused, but some smaller communities have permitted it, creating local controversy. The educational use of information from Nazi burial sites has been incorporated into Holocaust education and historical presentation. Museums and memorial sites have used forensic evidence, artifacts discovered in graves, and documentation from burial investigations to construct exhibits that make abstract historical knowledge concrete. The physical evidence of a personal item buried with a Holocaust victim, displayed alongside information about that person's life and death, creates emotional connection that statistics cannot provide. This has been controversial when it involves displaying human remains or items taken from bodies, with debates about dignity, respect, and educational value. The comparison with how other societies have handled remains of historical criminals provides context. The Soviet Union generally cremated and scattered remains of executed Nazi leaders they held. The Western Allies varied in their approach, but generally preferred unmarked graves. Other societies facing similar questions about perpetrators of atrocities have adopted similar strategies. The bodies of individuals executed for crimes against humanity are rarely buried in marked permanent graves. The pattern suggests broad international consensus that such individuals forfeit the normal expectation of burial rites and memorial. The impact of climate change and environmental factors on burial sites has become a concern. Rising water tables, erosion, and severe weather events have disturbed graves that had remained undisturbed for decades. This has forced authorities to excavate remains before natural processes expose them, leading to unexpected discoveries. The effects of wartime damage to cemeteries and burial grounds continue to emerge as building foundations settle, sinkholes develop, and construction reveals damage from bombs and artillery that had been covered by rebuilding. The role of anonymous informants in revealing burial sites has been significant. Individuals who witnessed burials or helped dig graves often kept silent for decades, fearing retribution or prosecution. As they aged and time passed, some chose to reveal what they knew. These revelations have led authorities to numerous burial sites that would otherwise never have been discovered. The motivations for coming forward vary. Some sought absolution or clearing of conscience. Others wanted to ensure historical truth was recorded before they died. Some simply felt enough time had passed that revealing information carried no more risk. The technical challenges of excavating World War II-era graves are substantial. Unexploded ordnance can be buried near or with human remains. Toxic materials, including chemicals, heavy metals, and degraded materials, pose health hazards. The remains themselves may be in poor condition due to soil conditions, depth, and time elapsed. Forensic teams must work carefully to preserve evidence while protecting their own safety. The documentation required to maintain chain of custody for potential legal proceedings or historical archives adds layers of bureaucratic complexity to what is already difficult work. The intersection of Nazi burial sites with urban development creates recurring problems. Berlin, Munich, Nuremberg, and other German cities were heavily bombed and then rebuilt. Construction continues to reveal remains, artifacts, and structures from the Nazi era. Every major construction project requires archaeological assessment and sometimes full excavation. This has delayed projects, increased costs, and created political complications when developers want to proceed, but historians insist on thorough investigation. The balance between development and historical preservation remains contentious. The treatment of burial sites of Nazi victims versus perpetrators has been stark and deliberate. Victims receive memorial, identification efforts, and dignified burial where possible. Perpetrators receive documentation for historical records, and then disposal designed to prevent memorial. The asymmetry is intentional, reflecting moral judgment encoded into policy. This represents a departure from traditional practices that treated all dead with similar respect, regardless of moral character in life. The departure reflects the exceptional nature of Nazi crimes and the ongoing political risks of neo-Nazi movements. The question of what should happen to Nazi burial sites that remain undiscovered has no clear answer. Some argue that all such sites should be actively searched for, identified, and dealt with definitively. Others argue that sites currently unknown pose no threat. and should be left undisturbed unless accidentally discovered. The resources required for systematic searches would be enormous, and the benefit compared to other historical preservation efforts is debatable. Current policy in Germany and other affected countries tends toward responding to discoveries rather than actively searching, with exceptions for specific individuals whose burial sites are considered particularly important to locate. The evolution of German attitudes toward this history is reflected in changing approaches to burial sites. Immediately after the war, destruction of Nazi remains and elimination of grave sites was driven partly by Allied policy and partly by German desire to distance themselves from the Nazi past. By the 1970s and 1980s, as generations who had lived through the war aged and died, a more measured historical approach emerged that emphasized documentation and education rather than destruction. Current policy attempts to balance historical investigation with preventing neo-Nazi exploitation while respecting human dignity, even for those who forfeited moral status through their crimes. The international dimensions of Nazi burial sites extend beyond Germany. Austria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Russia, and other countries where Nazi officials operated or fled hold burial sites of varying significance. Cooperation between nations on excavation, identification, and disposition of remains has been generally good, but not without complications. Different legal frameworks, different historical relationships with the Nazi period, and different contemporary political situations affect how each nation approaches these sites. The final secrets that emerged from Nazi burial sites were often anticlimactic, investigators hoping to find documentation of hidden assets, evidence of unknown crimes, or revelations about final days often found only bones, dental work, and occasional personal items. The bodies themselves revealed information about health, diet, and sometimes cause of death. But the dramatic secrets that fiction suggests should exist in such places rarely materialized. The real value of these discoveries was usually prosaic confirmation of historical accounts, resolution of questions about who died, where, and when, and denial of opportunities for conspiracy theorists and neo-Nazis to claim that Nazi leaders escaped justice. The destruction of Hitler's, Goebbels's, and other top Nazis' remains by Soviet authorities in 1970, kept secret until Russian archives revealed it decades later, represented a final decision about how to handle the physical remnants of Nazi leadership. By ensuring no remains existed that could become relics or rally points, the Soviets made a choice that most historians and authorities now view as appropriate. The same logic has been applied to other graves as they're discovered. The pattern is clear and likely to continue. When burial sites of Nazi leaders are found, the remains are documented for historical records and then destroyed in ways that prevent any memorial or recovery. No grave markers are permitted, no pilgrimage sites are allowed. The individuals who committed atrocities are denied the normal human privilege of a final resting place marked and remembered. This represents society's ultimate judgment on them. They will be remembered in history books, but they will not be remembered with honor. They have no place where their names are inscribed in stone. They have no graves where flowers can be placed. They exist only in historical record as examples of how far human evil can extend and how civilization must respond to such evil decisively. The secrets that emerged from Nazi burial sites after 80 years were ultimately not about treasure or revelations, but about confirmation that justice denied them in life could at least be enacted in death by ensuring they have no resting place, no memorial, and no mark of their passage except historical condemnation. The question of what constitutes appropriate treatment of Nazi burial sites extends beyond the leadership to include the hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who died fighting for the Nazi regime. Military cemeteries across Europe contain the graves of Wehrmacht soldiers who fought in the name of a genocidal government. These cemeteries have sparked debates about whether soldiers who served the Nazi regime deserve the same memorial treatment as soldiers who fought in other conflicts. The German War Graves Commission maintains these cemeteries, arguing that ordinary soldiers were not necessarily war criminals and deserved dignified burial regardless of the regime they served. Critics argue that maintaining these graves with public funds honors a military that enabled the Holocaust. The compromise reached in most countries allows the graves to remain, but without glorification, with simple markers and minimal ceremony. The discovery of mass graves containing both perpetrators and victims has created particularly difficult situations. In some locations, Nazi officials executed prisoners and were themselves killed days or weeks later, with all bodies dumped in the same location. Forensic investigation of these sites requires separating remains, identifying individuals, and making decisions about how to memorialize victims while disposing of perpetrators' remains. The physical proximity of these bodies in death creates ethical dilemmas about how to treat them differently in memorial. Some sites have chosen to create memorials only for victims, removing perpetrators' remains to undisclosed locations. Others have created educational displays explaining that the site contains both victims and perpetrators, using the proximity to teach about the chaos of the Reich's collapse. The psychological impact on excavation teams working on Nazi burial sites deserves acknowledgement. Forensic anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians who spend months excavating and analyzing remains from this period describe the emotional toll of confronting evidence of atrocities, working with remains of murdered children, examining bones that show evidence of torture, and processing the scale of systematic killing affects mental health even for experienced professionals. Many institutions now provide psychological support for teams working on Holocaust-related excavations, recognizing that exposure to evidence of genocide creates trauma that requires professional treatment. The legal complexities of property rights over burial sites have created unexpected complications. When Nazi officials' graves are discovered on private property, questions arise about who has authority to excavate, who pays for the work, and what happens to the property afterward. German law gives authorities broad powers to investigate and excavate sites related to Nazi crimes, even on private land. But property owners have sued for compensation when excavations disrupt their use of land or reduce property values. Courts have generally ruled that historical investigation takes precedence over property rights in these cases, but litigation has delayed some investigations and created resentment among property owners who feel unfairly burdened by history not of their making. The role of survivor testimony in locating burial sites has been invaluable but complicated. Holocaust survivors and witnesses to executions have provided information about burial locations decades after the events. Their testimony has led investigators to numerous sites that would otherwise never have been found. But memory fades and distorts over time. Witnesses genuinely trying to help have sometimes provided inaccurate information, leading to expensive excavations of wrong locations. Balancing respect for survivors with the need for accurate information requires sensitivity and careful corroboration of testimony with other evidence before committing resources to excavation. The treatment of Nazi burial sites in former Eastern Bloc countries differs from Western approaches due to different historical relationships with the Nazi period and Soviet occupation. In Poland, where both Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia committed atrocities, burial sites of Nazi officials receive little protection or investigation unless they overlap with sites important to Polish national memory. In Russia, where Nazi remains from the war are periodically discovered, authorities generally dispose of them with minimal publicity, viewing them as debris from a defeated enemy rather than subjects for historical investigation. In Czech Republic, Austria, and other countries occupied by Nazi Germany, approaches vary based on local politics and the specific individuals buried. The impact of television documentaries and media coverage on burial site investigations has been significant. High-profile excavations attract media attention that can be helpful in generating public support and funding, but can also sensationalize findings and create pressure for premature conclusions. The balance between public interest in Nazi history and the need for careful scholarly work has been difficult to maintain. Some investigations have been rushed to meet media deadlines, potentially compromising accuracy. Others have been conducted in secrecy to avoid media interference, creating suspicion about what authorities might be hiding. Most institutions now try to manage media relationships carefully, providing access after initial forensic work is complete but before final conclusions are drawn. The comparison between treatment of Nazi burial sites and sites associated with other historical atrocities provides perspective. The graves of Soviet officials responsible for Stalin's purges and forced collectivizations have generally not been disturbed in Russia. The remains of individuals who committed atrocities during colonialism are often buried in honored places in their home countries. The tombs of Confederate leaders in the United States have become sites of controversy, but generally remain in place. The unique treatment of Nazi burial sites reflects both the exceptional nature of Holocaust crimes and the particular way Germany and other affected nations have chosen to confront this history. No universal standard exists for how to treat burial sites of those who committed crimes against humanity, but the Nazi cases have established precedents that influence how other situations are handled. The question of children's remains discovered in Nazi burial sites creates special ethical concerns. The Goebbels children, murdered by their parents, were cremated and scattered along with their parents' remains. But other cases involve children of Nazi officials who died from natural causes or accidents during the war. Should these innocent children's graves be preserved normally, or does association with parents who were war criminals justify different treatment? Most authorities have concluded that children's graves should be respected regardless of parentage, but when those graves become neo-Nazi gathering points, authorities have sometimes relocated remains to undisclosed locations. The principle that children bear no responsibility for parents' crimes conflicts with the practical problem of preventing graves from becoming political symbols. The evolution of forensic techniques has meant that remains examined decades ago can be reanalyzed with methods unavailable at the time. DNA analysis has confirmed or corrected identifications made based on dental records or physical anthropology. This has led to cases where remains thought to belong to one individual were later identified as someone else. The possibility of future technological advances that might provide additional information creates arguments for preserving remains in storage rather than destroying them, but this conflicts with the policy of preventing any possibility of Nazi remains becoming relics. Current practice tends toward documentation through photographs, measurements, and DNA samples, then destruction of remains, preserving information while eliminating physical objects that could be venerated. The financial costs of investigating Nazi burial sites are substantial. Full excavation, forensic analysis, historical research, and site remediation can cost hundreds of thousands of euros per location. Deciding which sites warrant this investment requires difficult judgments about historical significance, educational value, and practical considerations. Sites likely to become neo-Nazi gathering points receive priority for investigation and elimination. Sites that might provide important historical information or identify unknown victims also receive resources, but limited budgets mean many sites are left undisturbed unless accidentally discovered or specifically problematic. The economic dimension of these decisions is rarely discussed publicly but significantly influences policy. The impact of burial site discoveries on historical understanding has been mixed. The Bormann discovery definitively resolved questions about his fate and ended speculation about escape to South America. But most discoveries confirm what historians already believed rather than revealing dramatic new information. The value is often in the confirmation itself, in removing uncertainty and denying conspiracy theorists room to operate. When physical evidence confirms written and testimonial evidence, the historical record becomes more robust, even if no new facts emerge. This validation function is important even if less dramatic than discovering completely unknown information. The treatment of burial sites associated with the T4 euthanasia program and other early Nazi crimes has received less attention than sites related to high-ranking officials. The victims of these programs were often buried in unmarked mass graves that have only recently been located and investigated. The perpetrators, medical personnel who administered lethal injections or operated gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, mostly escaped immediate justice and died natural deaths decades later. Their graves exist in normal cemeteries, often unknown to local communities. Whether these sites should be investigated and the remains relocated depends on whether they've become problems. The general principle has been to act on discovered information rather than systematically searching for all possible sites. The role of local communities in deciding how to handle discovered burial sites varies widely. Some communities have embraced historical investigation, supporting excavations and educational programs about what occurred in their area. Others have resisted, wanting to move on from dark history and resenting outside attention that damages their community's reputation. These tensions between historical truth and community self-image create real conflicts that have no easy resolution. Authorities generally prioritize historical investigation over community preferences, but better outcomes occur when communities are engaged as partners rather than subjected to imposed decisions. The preservation of burial sites as historical monuments versus elimination of them as potential neo-Nazi gathering points creates ongoing tension. Some argue that preserved sites with educational interpretations serve important functions, teaching future generations about Nazi crimes through confrontation with physical evidence. Others argue that any site associated with Nazi leadership presents unacceptable risks of political exploitation. Current policy tends toward elimination for sites associated with perpetrators and preservation for sites associated with victims. But this distinction is not always clean, and mixed sites require case-by-case decisions. The international coordination required for comprehensive investigation of Nazi burial sites has been inadequate. Many Nazi officials and collaborators fled to foreign countries where they lived under false identities until natural death. Their burial sites exist in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Spain, Syria, and other countries that offered refuge. These nations have varying levels of interest in investigating these sites. Some have cooperated with international efforts. Others have resisted, viewing the investigations as interference in internal affairs or unwanted reminders of their role in harboring war criminals. Without consistent international cooperation, many Nazi burial sites outside Germany remain undocumented and undisturbed. The question of what happens when burial sites are discovered on land now belonging to Jewish families or Holocaust survivors creates particularly sensitive situations. Several cases have emerged where property purchased by survivors or their descendants after the war was later found to contain remains of Nazi officials. The psychological impact of discovering that one's home or land contains the buried remains of perpetrators is profound. In these cases, authorities have expedited investigations and removals, recognizing the special trauma this creates. But the fact that such situations occur at all demonstrates how thoroughly Nazi officials' final resting places were concealed and how randomly they resurface. The creation of databases documenting known and suspected Nazi burial sites has been controversial. Proponents argue that comprehensive documentation prevents accidental disturbance, aids historical research, and ensures systematic rather than haphazard investigation. Opponents argue that databases create roadmaps for neo-Nazis seeking sites to venerate and for grave robbers seeking Nazi memorabilia to steal and sell. Current practice involves classified databases maintained by government authorities, accessible to researchers with legitimate purposes but not publicly available. This balance attempts to serve historical investigation while preventing misuse of information. The treatment of Nazi burial sites in Israel presents unique dimensions. Some Nazi officials or collaborators were buried in areas that later became part of Israel. Their graves have been eliminated whenever discovered, with the remains destroyed without the documentation and analysis that might occur in Europe. Israeli policy reflects the perspective that perpetrators of genocide against the Jewish people forfeit any consideration for their remains. While some scholars argue this approach loses historical information that could be valuable, Israeli public opinion overwhelmingly supports immediate destruction without research when Nazi graves are found. The impact of burial site investigations on neo-Nazi movements has been significant. The systematic elimination of graves that could serve as pilgrimage sites has forced neo-Nazi groups to create symbolic or virtual memorials instead. Online forums and events at locations associated with Nazi history, but lacking physical graves, have partially filled this gap. But the lack of actual burial sites to visit has limited the emotional and symbolic power of these gatherings. Law enforcement officials credit the grave elimination policy with reducing neo-Nazi activity compared to what might exist if physical memorials were available. The generational shift in attitudes toward Nazi burial sites is evident. Older Germans who lived through the war and its immediate aftermath often preferred to forget and move forward rather than excavate and investigate. Younger generations have generally supported more thorough historical investigation, viewing confrontation with the past as necessary for ensuring it never repeats. This generational divide has influenced policy as older officials retired and younger ones with different perspectives assumed responsibility. The trend has been toward more transparency and more systematic investigation over time. The secrets that emerged from Nazi burial sites after 80 years were ultimately more about confirmation than revelation, more about denial of memorial than discovery of treasure, more about societal judgment than historical mystery. The physical remains of Nazi leadership were destroyed, scattered, or buried in unknown locations deliberately to ensure they could never become objects of veneration. The policy reflected democratic society's judgment that those who commit genocide forfeit the normal human right to a marked grave and remembered resting place. When sites were discovered accidentally, they were investigated, documented, and then eliminated to maintain this policy. The message sent by this treatment is clear and intentional. Democratic societies will remember Nazi crimes in museums, memorials, and history books. They will remember victims with honor and sympathy. But they will not remember perpetrators with anything except condemnation. The graves are gone. Graves. The names exist only in historical records of infamy. The physical places where their bodies rest are deliberately unknown and unmarked. This represents justice as enacted through memorial policy, ensuring that those who sought to eliminate peoples from the earth are themselves eliminated from physical memory, existing only as examples of human evil that must be studied to be prevented but never honored, never commemorated, and never given the memorial that marks human life as having mattered. The Nazi burial sites that were opened after 80 years revealed this truth most clearly. Society's choice to deny perpetrators any resting place represents judgment enacted through policy, maintained through generations, and justified by the magnitude of crimes that can never be forgiven and must never be forgotten.